They said, "You eat, but don't help." So I left quietly and sold the house they lived in. Then he eats like a pig and does nothing. I'm not her babysitter, so maybe she should take the hint and get out before I have to kick her out. The words were sharp, meant to wound, not warn. They dropped heavy into the silence of our modest dinner table, like a stone in still water, rippling out across plates of meatloaf and overcooked peas. My fork paused midair, halfway to my mouth, and then nothing. My son kept eating, head down. Not a word, not a glance in my direction. He didn't defend me, didn't object, didn't even blink. His silence screamed louder than her outburst. Across the table, my grandson looked confused. He was too young to understand everything, but he understood enough to fall quiet, the way children do when the air becomes too heavy with adult anger. I chewed, swallowed, then carefully set my fork down beside my plate. I said nothing, didn't cry, didn't plead, didn't explain how the arthritis in my hands made it hard to scrub floors, or how the pain in my back made bending down near impossible. I didn't remind them that I cooked when I could, folded laundry when my fingers allowed, or that I had spent my youth and then my middle age keeping this very family from falling apart. I simply began collecting the dishes. That was how I responded. Not with rage, not with tears, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had swallowed things far more bitter than insults. Later that night, I lay in the guest room, if you could call it that. A converted storage space with a single bed, no closet, and a single window too high to look out of. The ceiling fan above me clicked with every turn. I stared at it and waited for sleep that wouldn't come. From the living room, I could hear them laughing. Samantha and my son, their voices low, a glass clinking, a TV show I couldn't make out. My grandson had long gone to bed. I didn't cry, but I felt something colder settle into my chest. A kind of quiet resignation that came not from one insult, but from years of slow erosion. I had been fading for a long time. Tonight had only sharpened the outline. I thought back, because that's what old women do when they can't sleep and no one wants their stories anymore. I thought of the years when my husband was sick, dying slowly, painfully with dignity I helped preserve. I was the one who washed his clothes when he soiled them. I was the one who held his spoon when he couldn't grip it. I was the one who kept the house from falling apart with tape, string, and coupons cut from old newspapers. I thought of my son Jason when he was a boy. How I worked double shifts at the dry cleaners to buy him school supplies. How I sewed buttons on his uniform late at night. How I cheered the loudest at his high school graduation, though I sat at the back because we could only afford 2 seats and gave the front to his girlfriend. And now I was a mouth to feed. I didn't leave the next morning. That would have been too simple, too obvious. No, I stayed. I made coffee just like I had every morning since moving in. I folded the laundry, picked up the toys left on the stairs, repaired a button on my grandson's jacket without being asked, but I said nothing. 2 days later, they left for a weekend trip, a family getaway. I was not invited. Samantha said something about needing space and just a couple's weekend. Jason avoided my eyes again. That's when I packed 1 suitcase, a small bag of documents, my rosary, and my leather-bound notebook. I didn't leave a note, just the house key placed on the kitchen table next to a folded dish towel I had washed and dried that morning. I took the bus across town. No taxi, no help, just me and my aching knees. The care home wasn't fancy. In fact, it was one of the cheapest I could find that still had clean sheets and didn't smell like despair. The woman at the front desk gave me a form to fill. She didn't ask why I was there. Maybe she already knew. I smiled through it all. I said things like, "I just like peace and quiet, and it's only temporary." But inside, I felt hollow. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed that night in a room that smelled of boiled peas and bleach and stared at the window. I could see nothing but the shadow of a tree, and for the first time I wondered, had I become a burden? Was I truly just someone who ate? That thought, that cruel, simple thought, sat with me into the early morning, but then something else stirred. A quieter voice, one I hadn't heard in a long time, one that said, "What if they're wrong?" The next morning, I brewed my own tea just the way I liked it. I wrapped myself in the blanket I had crocheted 2 winters ago, and I picked up the phone. "James," I said, my voice trembled just slightly. It had been years since I'd spoken to my husband's oldest friend. He had once been our lawyer, helping us with the will, the insurance, the paperwork after the cancer. "Do you remember the house deed?" I asked. There was a pause, then a low voice. "Yes, I remember everything about that day." 3 days later, I sat in his office. The same dusty books, the same smell of leather and old papers. He pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. "You should have received a copy," he said. I opened it. There it was. My name, the address, the signature, the house I had been told to leave. The house I had once fought to keep for my son was mine, fully legally, since 1994. Signed over by my husband before he died. "I never told anyone," I whispered. James gave a soft smile. "Maybe now is the time." I took the folder. My hands were steady. I didn't know what I would do with this power, but I knew this much. I wasn't just someone who ate, and I would no longer let that be the last thing they remembered about me. 3 days after I left that house, I stood in front of a building I hadn't entered in over a decade. The brass letters still spelled out his name, James Callahan, attorney at law. James had been my husband's best friend. They played baseball together in high school, went to the same university, and somehow remained loyal even as life pulled them in different directions. James had helped us draft our wills, settled the insurance paperwork, and transferred the deed back when my husband's cancer diagnosis made everything feel like it was running out of time. I sat in the leather chair across from his old oak desk, surrounded by dust and legal books that hadn't moved in years. He looked older, of course. So did I. He didn't say anything when I walked in. Just poured me a cup of tea the way he always used to. 2 sugars, no milk. When he finally spoke, it was quiet and without question. "You want me to pull the deed?" I nodded. James moved with slow precision, opening a locked drawer and pulling out a thick manila folder. He laid it down in front of me, opening it with a reverence that reminded me of a priest unveiling scripture. There it was. My name for legal ownership, address of the house, date, June 12th, 1994, signature. My husband's trembling hand witnessed and notarized. The house that I had scrubbed and polished and fed generations in. The house I had been told to leave was mine legally, completely, and had been for 30 years. I stared at it like it was a photograph of someone I had once loved, lost, and nearly forgotten. "I didn't know he followed through," I said quietly. James smiled gently. "He came in the week after he got the terminal diagnosis. Told me he didn't want you to ever end up homeless. Said, and I quote, 'She built this family. She should never have to ask to stay in her own home.' I pressed my hand to my chest. That man, even dying, had been thinking of me. Not just sentimentally, but practically, legally, protectively. "I never told Jason," I whispered. James tilted his head. "Did you think you'd never need to?" I took a long breath. I thought they'd always remember who I was. James nodded slowly, like he understood the ache between the words. "I've kept it updated every year as instructed," he said. "Taxes, documentation, trust filings. It's airtight." I looked at the paper again. In my bones, I had always known I was not a guest in that house. But to see it, ink on paper, filed with the county clerk's office, tied to my name, it was like someone had reached back in time and handed me a truth I had almost forgotten. I had not asked for charity. I had been robbed of dignity, and now I had the keys. Not the ones that jingled, the real ones, the ones that unlocked the soul from shame. "I want to sell it," I said. My voice didn't shake. James didn't blink. "I'll draw up the paperwork quietly," I added. "I want them to hear it from the letter, not from me." And he didn't question that either. I left his office with the folder pressed to my chest like it was armor. Outside, the air smelled of rain-soaked leaves and diesel. A passing bus whooshed past. The world went on, but inside me, something had changed. Not anger, not revenge, just balance. For years I had lived in their house, but the truth was, they had been living in mine. That night, I returned to the care home with a paper bag of pastries for the kitchen staff and a small bouquet for Helen, the woman in the room down the hall, who'd once confessed through tears that her daughter-in-law made her eat alone in the laundry room. She and I shared tea in silence. And after she left, I opened the folder again, spread the documents on my narrow bed, and began reading each line with the attention of a woman finally ready to stop apologizing for existing. My husband had signed it over with love. I would sign it away with clarity. And this time they would learn I wasn't just someone who ate. I was the woman who held the deed. And now I knew exactly what to do with it. The room was small, barely large enough for a twin bed, a narrow dresser, and a chair by the window that faced the parking lot. but it was mine. And in that simplicity, there was a kind of peace I had not known in years. There were no slamming doors, no whispered complaints, no passive-aggressive sigh when I asked for help. Just silence. And in that silence, I rediscovered something I hadn't realized I had lost. The care home was modest, far from luxurious, but it was clean. The staff were kind in the way only people paid too little and working too hard could be. And the other residents, well, we were a quiet tribe of the forgotten, each carrying a story no one had asked to hear. I began helping where I could, not because I had to, but because I wanted to feel useful again. I folded laundry in the common room, helped the kitchen staff portion out lunch trays, and read letters aloud for a woman whose vision had faded to shadows. On Sundays, I would lead a small knitting group, even though my own hands were slower now. That's how I met Helen. She was wiry, sharp-tongued, with a walker covered in pink ribbons. But when she laughed, it was the laugh of someone who had loved too deeply and lost too completely. We shared more than yarn and weak tea. Helen, like me, had been invited to leave her son's home after her husband died. She'd raised 2 boys, survived breast cancer, and still had been told at 79 that she was a burden. She didn't cry when she told me that, but I saw the tremble in her hands. "It's like they erased me," she said one night, "like I stopped existing when I stopped being useful." That sentence clung to my chest like a pin. I knew that feeling, and I knew then I would not die in a room that smelled of antiseptic and boiled peas without making sure my story ended with more than silence. That weekend I called James again. We met in the same office, same desk, same heavy folders. "I'm ready," I said. He didn't ask what I meant. He just nodded and opened the file. The paperwork took time, titles, disclosures, confirmation of property value, but the house was in good condition, and in that neighborhood, it would sell fast. When he passed the final document across the table, I took a moment not to hesitate, but to remember the birthday parties held in the backyard, the smell of Christmas ham baking in that oven, the day my husband carried me over that threshold, half laughing, half terrified about the mortgage. I signed with hands steadier than I thought I had left. "I want it kept quiet," I said. "No warnings, no calls." James nodded. "They'll get the notification the day after escrow closes." Perfect. I walked back to the care home with a strange mix of sorrow and satisfaction in my chest. I wasn't doing this to punish them. I was doing this because for once in my life, I was choosing myself. And that night, as I slipped under the thin covers of my narrow bed, I slept like I hadn't in years. Not because I was finally free, but because I had finally acted. 6 months passed, seasons turned, leaves yellowed and dropped, and the sky shifted from summer heat to the sober gray of autumn. I had almost forgotten the date, almost. Then James called. "It's done," he said simply. "Funds have cleared. The house officially belongs to the new owners. You'll get the deposit statement in 2 days." I thanked him. I hung up and I waited. It did not take long. The letter must have arrived that same week. Certified mail, one from the bank, one from the real estate office, and another hand-delivered notifying them to vacate within 30 days. By Sunday evening, my son called. I didn't answer. He called again the next day and again and again. Finally, I sent a message. The transfer was legal. The home was mine. I simply took back the meal I once paid for. There was silence after that for a day. Then it came, Samantha's voice shrill and cracked with disbelief. "You evil old woman. You sold our house. This was our home." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let my tone change. I simply answered, "No, it was my home. You just lived there. Rent-free like I once fed you both. Now it's someone else's turn." She hung up. No thank you, no apology, just fury. I stood at the window of Haven House that evening, watching the lights flicker across the courtyard. Somewhere, Helen was humming to herself, trying to remember the next verse of a hymn. I hadn't known it would feel like this. Not triumphant, not bitter, just still. The next morning, the phone rang again. This time it was Jason. He sounded like a child again. "Mom," he whispered. "We're going to lose everything." I stayed silent. "We have nowhere to go, the kids." "Samantha's crying every day." I messed up. I should have stopped her. I should have said something. I let him speak. When he finished, I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I said what I had rehearsed quietly in my heart. "I'm not taking anything from you. I'm only reclaiming what you thought I had forgotten. I'm not asking for love. I'm asking for recognition." There was a long pause. Then he asked the question I had known was coming. Is there any way you can undo it? And I answered with the truth he needed to hear. Jason, I gave everything to raise you, and I never kept score. But the moment your wife opened her mouth and you said nothing, something changed. I don't want your money. I don't even want your apology. I just want my silence back. And this is how I earn it. The line went dead, and that was okay, because I had said what needed to be said. For once, I wasn't rescuing anyone. I was simply standing up for the version of me they thought would stay quiet forever. That night, I sat down with a cup of tea, the same kind I used to serve them with, Sunday pancakes and maple syrup. Only this time, the sweetness was mine alone, and peace, like revenge, had no need to shout. It simply arrived. There is a drawer in every mother's life that holds more than it seems. Mine was small, wooden, tucked beneath a dusty lamp in the corner of my room at Haven House. It held birthday cards, prayer beads, faded photographs, and one leather-bound notebook. My husband gave it to me on our 25th anniversary. On the first page, in his handwriting, it read, "For the things we never want to forget." And I hadn't. That evening, after Samantha's voice had stopped ringing in my ears, I opened that drawer with hands steadier than I expected. The notebook smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. At first, it had been a place for shopping lists and recipes, quick notes from church sermons, a reminder to send a thank you card. But over time, it had transformed quietly, organically, into something else, into a record, not of bitterness, not of blame, but of love. The kind given over and over without ever being returned as a receipt. I turned the pages. 1994, Jason's tuition after he dropped out, $2,300. 1996, closing the car loan, paid the first 5 months, $1,800. 1999, emergency room bill. Jason refused to let Samantha's insurance pay, $740. 2001, wedding gift so you can have a real honeymoon, $5,000. 2005, covered rent for 3 months during unemployment, $3,600. 2008, bought crib and stroller for first grandchild, $1,200. And on and on. 30 years of quiet generosity, moments I had forgotten until now. Until being called a burden forced me to account for what I had carried. I kept reading. 2011, down payment for their second car, $4,000. 2013, replaced their water heater when it broke, $950. 2015, helped with IVF costs, $7,000. 2017, paid for Samantha's dental surgery, $2,100. 2020, pandemic groceries, $4,500 across 5 months. The total over $120,000, maybe more. I had never calculated before. But now they had forced me to. I remember whispering to myself, I used to give without keeping track, but they made me start counting. And it broke my heart to see it all laid bare. Not because I regretted it, but because they had pretended it never happened. So I made copies, each page, neatly labeled and organized. And I gave it to James, my lawyer, as a kind of living will, a testament not of material wealth but of maternal labor. This isn't for revenge, I told him. This is so that someday, if they ask why, I won't have to say a word. The numbers will speak for themselves. He looked at me across his mahogany desk and nodded slowly. You're not wrong, Ruth, he said. You're just finally being honest about what it cost. I smiled faintly, not from satisfaction, but from clarity, because I had loved them more than they'd ever noticed. And now I had proof that my silence hadn't meant absence. It had meant sacrifice. That night, I placed the original notebook back in its drawer. But this time, I added one final entry, 2023. Sold the house, built a new one for women like me. Called it Haven House, worth $0 in interest. Value immeasurable. I closed the book and whispered. They thought I was just an old woman who ate without giving. But I fed them daily for decades, and now I'm finally feeding myself. When the house sold, the money didn't feel like triumph. It felt like closure. I didn't spend it on cruises or new clothes or revenge. I didn't want to teach them a lesson. I wanted to build something that spoke louder than resentment. So I went looking, not for a place to live, but for a purpose. It started with a visit to a small building on the east side of town. 4 units, faded paint, a sagging porch that needed new wood, but it had good bones, and it was quiet. The agent looked at me like I was lost. Most folks your age look for retirement communities, she said. This isn't exactly luxury. I'm not looking for luxury, I replied. I'm looking for use. I bought it that day. Then I named it Haven House. Below the nameplate, I added a simple phrase engraved into the wood. No one here proves their worth to stay. I didn't want it to be just a shelter. I wanted it to be a home and a place for women like me, like Helen, like the many invisible elders who'd been told they were burdens, who had been tolerated, not loved, dismissed, not cherished. It took a few weeks to get things in shape. I hired a local handyman, Tommy, whose mother had been in a care home too. He worked weekends for free once he learned what the house would be. You're building something good, he said. Feels rare these days. We painted walls, planted herbs in old bathtubs turned into garden beds. I furnished the rooms with warmth instead of price tags. Soft chairs, good lighting, a kettle always ready. I invited Helen to be the first resident. She cried when she walked in. You didn't forget me, she whispered. Of course not, I said. We remember those who've been forgotten. Over time, we welcomed 3 more. All women with stories etched into the lines around their eyes. Some had been cast out by children. Others had outlived everyone they ever loved. There was Miss Beatrice, who used to be a school teacher. She still corrected our grammar with a wink. There was Marion, who once ran a flower shop and now grew basil on the windowsill like it was her life's prize. And there was Roland, our first man, a widower who cooked better than any of us and always had a joke ready. I became the unofficial manager. I bought groceries, organized doctor visits, and helped them review their legal papers when needed. On Thursdays, I brewed tea and read the local paper aloud. On Sundays, we played records and danced in socks on the wood floor. One day, Roland paused while slicing tomatoes and looked at me across the counter. You know, he said, we're alive today because someone once called you a leech. I froze, then laughed. A deep, stunned laugh. Ironic, isn't it? I said. He nodded. You turned pain into shelter. That's more than most ever manage. That night, I wrote a new entry in my notebook. They called me a burden, but with the money from that burden, I'm feeding 4 souls who now sleep in peace. The house didn't have locks on the inside doors, not because we didn't value privacy, but because we had nothing to hide. We trusted each other in ways our own families had failed to do. One evening, as the sun poured golden over the porch, I stood with Helen holding mugs of chamomile tea. It'll ought to be happy again, she said softly. You're not alone, I told her. She smiled. Neither are you. And for once I believed it. Because Haven House wasn't just walls and windows. It was a statement, a memory turned into meaning. And every laugh, every shared meal, every quiet nap in the sunlit chairs was proof that I was never just someone who ate and did nothing. I had been someone who gave, who endured, who remembered, and now I was someone who rebuilt. He came to see me, not with arrogance, not with rehearsed excuses, but with the kind of silence that only desperation brings. It had been almost a year. I recognized him instantly, though he looked older. Not by time, but by burden. His shoulders were hunched. His eyes, my God, his eyes were nothing like the boy who once begged me to stay a little longer at bedtime. I know I don't deserve to be here, he said quietly. I said nothing. I just motioned for him to sit. We lost the house, he continued. Samantha left. She said I should have fought harder, but I didn't know what to say back then. Mom, I didn't know what to do. His voice cracked on the word Mom. We have nothing now. I sleep on a friend's couch. I work nights. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Still, I said nothing. Instead, I opened a small box I kept beside my chair. From it, I pulled out a single photograph. It showed the early days of Haven House, the porch still unpainted, the garden bare. But in the center, 4 people laughing, holding paintbrushes, shoes kicked off, a house becoming a home. I handed it to him. He looked down at it, confused at first. Then realization dawned. You built this? He whispered. With the money from our house, I nodded. And you didn't spend it on yourself? I shook my head. I spent it on something that could grow. He looked back at the photo, then up at me. Why? Now I finally spoke. Because I ate your rice for 1 year, I said gently. But you ate mine for 30. I'm only collecting a little interest. His mouth opened, closed. No words came. I stood up. My legs ached more these days, but I stood tall. I didn't come here to hurt you, he finally said. I know. I just wanted to say thank you for everything I never said thank you for. I studied him. The stubble on his chin, the worry lines his youth once smoothed over. "There's something you still need to understand," I said. He looked at me, waiting. I never needed repayment. I needed respect. I needed to know my years weren't erased because I slowed down, that the hands that once held your fevered head weren't suddenly useless because they trembled. He lowered his eyes. "I forgot who you were," he whispered. "No," I said. "You remembered too late." A pause. "Then can I help with the house? With the other residents?" I shook my head. "This place doesn't need your guilt. It needs your growth. Live better, love better. That's how you honor what I gave." He nodded slowly. As he rose to leave, I reached into the box once more and handed him a copy of the deed. Not to Haven House, but to his own future. It was blank, a clean page. "Go fill this with something worthy," I said. He held it like it was gold. "I will." And for the first time in years, I believed him. It was a quiet spring afternoon, the kind that moved slowly, like the day itself had nowhere urgent to be. The breeze wandered through the trees like it was browsing a familiar bookstore, unhurried and content, while the scent of wild lilac and distant rain folded into the air like an old memory returning home. I sat on the porch of Haven House with a teacup in hand. It was chipped on the rim, just a little, but it was mine, and it fit the curve of my palm like it remembered me. I watched as the late sun stretched long shadows across the yard, laying soft gold on the gravel path and coaxing warmth out of the flagstone. Helen sat under the pergola, arguing playfully with Roland, her voice as dry and sharp as ever. They were at it again about green beans, whether to steam or sauté, add garlic or bacon fat. Miss B was on the swing, her hands moving steadily through loops of yarn, knitting a scarf for someone who hadn't asked, but who would surely be grateful all the same. "You might think this place is a care home, but you'd be wrong. This wasn't a place to be taken care of. This was a place where people remembered how to belong. These weren't just elderly residents. They were people who'd spent decades putting others first, quieting their own needs. And now they were finally laughing without fear. They were stories still unfolding, no longer shelved behind hospital curtains or family pity. I had just taken a sip when I noticed a woman approaching from the gate. I didn't recognize her. Thin, elegant, wearing a Sunday hat, too formal for a Tuesday. She walked like someone who used to wear heels even when she didn't have to. The kind of woman who had practiced smiling with just the right amount of reserve. She paused, glanced around, then made her way up the porch steps and sat beside me without asking. Something about her presence didn't demand permission. It just settled in. "You're the owner?" she asked. I nodded. She looked around the yard again, the chipped bird bath with a single sparrow hopping in and out, the homemade wind chimes made of old cutlery and glass beads, the riot of mismatched flowers someone had planted out of rhythm, but not out of love. "This place feels free," she said, almost like a confession. She looked at me, then studied my lined face, the tremor in my hand that I no longer tried to hide, the softness in my shoulders that had once carried the weight of 3 lives. "Why don't you live with your children?" she asked gently, not as an accusation, just curiosity wrapped in politeness. I didn't answer right away. I let the question float between us, light as pollen, suspended in the hush of the afternoon. I let it breathe, then I smiled. "I used to," I said, "but here I'm needed, not tolerated. No one here asks me to mop the floors to earn my meals. No one expects me to apologize for being alive." Her eyes didn't widen in shock, just softened like she knew. Like maybe she had one too. A daughter-in-law with a too-tight smile, a son with tired excuses, a quiet corner in someone else's house where she was placed instead of welcomed. We sat that way for a while, the silence between us full of understanding. Somewhere inside, the kettle began to whistle. It was a song I'd come to love. An old friend calling me back inside for warmth. Helen's voice rang out again from the pergola, loud and opinionated. "I don't care what Roland says. I'll die before I boil green beans." Roland's laugh answered her, rolling across the garden. Miss B chuckled without looking up from her yarn. The woman next to me smiled, a real one this time, one that started in her eyes. "I think I get it now," she said softly. I nodded, sipping my tea. "You don't always have to win the fight," I said. "Sometimes just walking away is the loudest thing you can do." The sun had dipped lower, brushing amber onto every leaf, every sill, every wrinkle. And somewhere inside that home, someone had started humming. An old church hymn, Out of tune, but not out of spirit. It wasn't grand. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. Enough to remind me that the quietest lives sometimes leave the deepest echo. Enough to let me know that the years I thought were stolen had bloomed again. Here, in chipped teacups and green bean debates and scarves no one asked for. This was my justice. Not a courtroom, not revenge, just a chair on a porch and the knowledge that I had built something that outlived bitterness. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most powerful kind of ending, or rather, the most beautiful kind of beginning. If you've ever been called a burden, if you've ever stayed silent just to keep the peace, if you've ever been made to feel like your worth ended with your usefulness, then hear this. You are not alone. I'm not telling you a story I heard. I'm not retelling something that happened to someone else. I am a mother from Pennsylvania, and I have lived this. Every bitter word, every cold glance, every thankless dinner and quiet ache that came from watching the people you once held in your arms look through you like furniture. And I have reclaimed every dollar, every sleepless night, every whispered insult they thought I'd forget. Because love, as I've come to understand, isn't always soft. Sometimes love is standing at a kitchen sink after being called a burden and washing dishes anyway because you know what kind of woman raised you. Sometimes love is putting one foot in front of the other down a hallway lined with the laughter of people who no longer see you. Sometimes love is signing your name on the dotted line and realizing that the only person who's going to save you is you. And sometimes love isn't about staying. It's about leaving without slamming the door, without shouting, without asking anyone to follow. It's building something new. Not for the family who left you behind, but for the strangers who needed someone to believe in them again. That's what I did. I took a home where I wasn't wanted and turned it into a home for people who'd been discarded just like me. Heaven House is more than a name. It's a statement that we do not have to die quietly, that our stories matter even if no one claps when we tell them, that the years we gave away freely were not wasted just because they were unappreciated. I didn't start out brave. I started out broken. But piece by piece, I remembered who I was before the world told me I was too old, too slow, too much. And you can too. If you're sitting there thinking no one would believe your story, if you're thinking it's too late to take back your voice, let me be the one to say it is not too late. You are not too old and you are not alone. I tell these stories because they need to be told, because silence is where injustice grows. Because for every woman like me who left a house with one suitcase and no plan, there are thousands more still making excuses for the cruelty they endure. I tell these stories for them, for the quiet ones, for the strong ones, for the ones who loved too hard and too long and now wonder if they imagined the whole thing. You didn't. You are not crazy. You are not the problem. You are a chapter they didn't finish reading. But that doesn't make it the end of your book. If this story stirred something in you, something tender, something furious, something that whispers, "I thought I was the only one," then I invite you to do one simple thing. Subscribe to Grandma True Stories, because here every mother has a voice, every sacrifice gets remembered, and every tear, every single one has a reason. This isn't just storytelling. This is remembering out loud. It's the sound of a woman finding her strength long after they thought she'd forgotten how to speak. It's the kind of truth that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Soft, yes, but never weak, and always, always. So, if you're ready to remember who you are, not who they told you to be, not who you became just to survive, but who you were before the world took pieces of you, then you are in the right place.